The 42nd law of power establishes a principle about tactical retreat and strategic wisdom. Knowing when to abandon a position, when to surrender, when to withdraw from conflict is often more powerful than fighting to the bitter end. Robert Greene's Law 42 teaches that the person who can retreat strategically, who can recognize when continued fighting damages more than victory could gain, often emerges more powerful than the person who fights every battle to exhaustion. This law recognizes that fighting every battle consumes resources, creates enemies, and damages your position even when you win. The person who fights to the last often wins the battle but loses the war through exhaustion and accumulated opposition. The person who recognizes when to retreat preserves resources, maintains optionality, and often emerges stronger than the person who fought to the end. The principle operates through understanding that some battles are not worth winning. The victory that costs you more than the gain is a defeat disguised as victory. The battle that exhausts your resources makes you vulnerable to future threats. The conflict that forces you to make concessions you'll regret becomes a hollow victory. The person who recognizes these dynamics and retreats lives to fight better battles later. Strategic retreat also creates psychological advantage. The person fighting to the end appears desperate and weakened. The person who can afford to retreat appears confident and secure. The retreat signals that you have other options, other battles worth fighting, other ways to achieve objectives. This confidence often intimidates opponents more than continued fighting would. Strategic retreat also prevents the humiliation of total defeat. The person who keeps fighting until completely defeated suffers maximum damage. The person who recognizes when defeat is coming and withdraws strategically preserves dignity. This preservation of dignity allows eventual return from a position of strength rather than from a position of complete defeat. Greene positions this law 42nd because it addresses a fundamental misunderstanding about power, that power means always winning, always fighting, never backing down. In reality, power often means knowing when to stop fighting, when to preserve resources for battles that matter more, when to retreat in order to eventually advance stronger. Successfully implementing Law 42 requires developing the wisdom to recognize when retreat makes sense and the skill to retreat in ways that preserve power and dignity. The first mechanism is recognizing when continued fighting damages more than the goal is worth. You calculate not just whether you might win but what winning would cost and what losing would cost. Sometimes the cost of winning exceeds the value of the victory. The second mechanism is understanding that retreat is not defeat. The person who confuses retreat with defeat fights until destroyed. The person who understands that retreat preserves resources for future battles can withdraw strategically. Retreat is a tactical choice, not a failure. The third mechanism is maintaining face while retreating. The crude retreat that appears desperate damages your power. The strategic retreat that appears to be a deliberate choice preserves your dignity. You frame the retreat as choosing not to continue rather than being forced to withdraw. The fourth mechanism is ensuring that retreat is temporary rather than permanent. The strategic retreat anticipates return. You withdraw resources from one battle to apply them elsewhere. You preserve the option to return to the original conflict later under better circumstances. The retreat is not surrender but repositioning. The fifth mechanism is using retreat to gather information and regroup. While others continue fighting, you withdraw and observe. You learn from what happened. You recover resources. You develop new strategies. You return stronger and better prepared. The sixth mechanism is recognizing that sometimes allowing an opponent to advance appears to weaken them. The opponent who advances without resistance often becomes overextended. The enemy lines become longer and thinner. Resources spread across larger territory become thinner. The strategic retreat allows the opponent to overextend themselves in ways that create future vulnerability. The seventh mechanism is understanding that retreating from one battle allows you to advance in other areas. Resources and attention committed to one battle are unavailable for other battles. By retreating from the losing battle, you can advance in battles where you have advantage. Throughout history, military commanders who mastered strategic retreat often achieved greater success than those who fought every battle to the end. One striking example comes from Napoleon's retreat from Russia. When his invasion of Russia became unsustainable, Napoleon withdrew despite the enormous cost in terms of soldiers and resources. The retreat appeared to be a devastating failure. However, Napoleon's willingness to retreat preserved his ability to fight future battles. Had he continued fighting and been completely destroyed, he would have lost everything. By retreating, he preserved enough force to fight again. Though he eventually fell, it took a coordinated effort of multiple nations to defeat him. The commander who would not retreat strategically would have been destroyed earlier. Similarly, military strategist George Washington succeeded partly through understanding when to retreat. Rather than fighting battles to the end, Washington would withdraw when circumstances favored the enemy. This strategic retreat preserved the American Army's ability to fight future battles. Commanders who understood retreat defeated commanders who fought every battle to the end. In business, executives who recognized when to exit failing ventures often succeeded better than those who continued fighting to save sinking ships. The executive who cuts losses and redirects resources often achieves greater success than the executive who exhausts resources trying to save failing initiatives. In personal relationships, people who recognized when to withdraw from toxic relationships often succeeded better than those who continued fighting to salvage them. The strategic withdrawal preserved emotional resources for healthier relationships. In political contexts, leaders who knew when to compromise, when to back down from fights they couldn't win, often maintained more power than those who fought every political battle. The politician who can appear to yield while actually retreating to defensible positions often survives longer than the politician who must win every conflict. In negotiations, the party that can afford to walk away from unfavorable deals often achieves better outcomes than the party desperate to reach any agreement. The willingness to retreat signals strength and prevents acceptance of poor terms. In contemporary business environments, entrepreneurs who know when to pivot away from failing business models often succeed better than those who fight to maintain failed approaches. The ability to recognize that a direction isn't working and strategically shift direction allows success where continued commitment would lead to failure. In competitive markets, companies that know when to retreat from unprofitable segments often maintain stronger overall positions than companies trying to compete everywhere. The strategic withdrawal from weak markets allows concentration on strong markets. In social and political contexts, activists who know when to retreat from losing battles often achieve more than those who continue fighting and exhaust resources. The strategic retreat allows regrouping and returning to battles where you have advantage. In creative fields, artists who know when to abandon failing projects often produce more successful work than those who continue fighting with failing work. The strategic retreat allows focus on promising directions. In personal development, people who know when to stop pursuing goals that no longer serve them often achieve more satisfaction than those who persist in pursuing outdated goals. The strategic withdrawal from paths that no longer fit allows pursuit of paths that actually matter. In online and social media contexts, figures who know when to retreat from controversial situations often preserve more reputation than those who continue fighting. The strategic withdrawal can allow eventual return under better circumstances. In professional advancement, employees who know when to leave unfavorable positions often advance faster than those who exhaust themselves fighting impossible situations. The strategic retreat to better opportunities often leads to greater success. One critical challenge in implementing Law 42 is developing accurate judgment about when retreat makes sense. Too much willingness to retreat becomes cowardice and undermines power. Too little willingness to retreat leads to exhaustion and destruction. The balance requires developing wisdom about which battles matter. The challenge also involves managing the psychological difficulty of retreat. Pride often resists retreat. The investment already made in a battle creates desire to continue fighting to justify that investment. The ego resistance to admitting defeat makes retreat psychologically difficult even when it's strategically sound. Overcoming this requires understanding that retreat is not failure but adaptation. The commander who retreats is wiser than the commander who fights to destruction. The executive who exits a failing initiative is more capable than the executive who exhausts company resources trying to save it. The person who withdraws from a toxic relationship is stronger than the person who continues the fight. Law 42 creates tensions with Law 28 about entering action with boldness. If you're too willing to retreat, you never commit fully to anything. The resolution is understanding that boldness and strategic retreat are not contradictory. You commit boldly to battles you choose to fight. You retreat strategically from battles you recognize as unwinnable or not worth the cost. The sophisticated approach involves committing fully to chosen battles while remaining willing to retreat if circumstances change dramatically. You don't second-guess yourself constantly or retreat at the first setback. But you do maintain the wisdom to recognize when continued fighting serves no purpose. With Law 35 about timing, knowing when to retreat involves timing. Some battles should be fought immediately while circumstances are favorable. Some battles should be avoided until you have advantage. The willingness to retreat now allows you to fight later from a stronger position. With Law 39 about stirring up waters, the strategic retreater often creates disruption through retreat. By withdrawing, you force the opponent to adjust. By appearing to surrender, you may cause the opponent to overcommit, which creates vulnerability. Understanding why retreat works requires examining how people interpret withdrawal. The person fighting to the end appears desperate and weakened. The person who can afford to withdraw appears confident and secure. Psychologically, strength is often demonstrated through the freedom to retreat rather than through commitment to endless fighting. There's also the element of resource management. The person fighting every battle to the end appears to have no other options. The person who can retreat appears to have alternatives, other paths to victory. This appearance of optionality creates respect. The opponent facing strategic retreat often experiences confusion. They expected continued fighting. The withdrawal requires them to adjust plans. The confusion created by unexpected retreat often works to your advantage as you regroup. Law 42 teaches that knowing when to retreat, when to surrender, when to withdraw from conflict is often more powerful than fighting every battle to the end. The person who fights to exhaustion often loses more than the person who recognizes when to stop fighting and preserve resources for battles that matter more. Master this law by developing wisdom about which battles are worth fighting, by recognizing when continued fighting costs more than the goal is worth, by understanding that retreat is not defeat but tactical positioning, by maintaining face while retreating, by ensuring retreat is temporary rather than permanent, and by using retreat strategically to regroup and eventually advance from strength. The 42nd law of power, then, is really a law of strategic wisdom and resource preservation. Those who master it understand that the person who fights every battle to the end often loses the war, while the person who knows when to retreat often emerges victorious. Know when to stop fighting, know when to preserve resources for battles that matter, and you'll discover that strategic withdrawal often proves more powerful than endless fighting ever could.